decision to appeal the High Court judgment on lockdown regulations that said that some lockdown regulations were invalid and unconstitutional. We're joined on the line by legal expert, via Skype, by legal expert Ulrich Roux. Mr. Roux, pleasure as always. Thank you very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Well, a blanket decision really by the court that the regulations are unconstitutional and invalid was bound to open up the decision to appeal by the state, wasn't it? What's your reaction to, first of all, the judgment itself, and then the prospects of the state as they plan to then appeal this matter?
I think it was a fair judgment, and the reason why I say it was a fair judgment is because the judge has given Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, as well as the government, an opportunity for 14 days to try and amend the current National Disaster or Disaster Management Act to be in line with the Constitution. So there is a grace period of 14 days within which the government can attempt to do so and receive guidance and take guidance from the court as well as their advisors to try and get these regulations in line with the Constitution. I must say that my first reaction, and it was announced nearly minutes ago, is that I'm disappointed that the state has elected to appeal this decision. And the reason why I say so is because if they looked at this decision clearly, they would have seen, well, we have 14 days. Let's put our heads together. Let's sit and see if we can identify the problem areas and try and get them in line with our Constitution, which is the apex law in our country. Yet now they've elected not to do so, and they're going to appeal it. So I think this is going to anger society to a large extent, where alternatively they could have decided to take this opportunity, but they haven't.
Yeah, we've basically been given a glimpse by the state on what their appeal will be based on. A short while ago, we heard the Minister in the Presidency, Jackson Mthembu, saying that all regulations were all there in efforts to save lives. Do you think that this will suffice in terms of going forward with this appeal? I mean, given that they've given us an idea of what they're sort of arming themselves with.
I think we must look at the judgment, and the judgment quite clearly sets out that the regulations currently in place are not only constitutional, but they are completely irrational. For instance, that people are allowed to travel in public transport, in a taxi, 10 people in a taxi, but yet you are not allowed to have your hair cut by a hairdresser where you are one person with the hairdresser in the hair salon. So it's not only a constitutional issue, it's a rationality issue. And that is why I'm saying, of course, the government is doing their best in these circumstances. And of course, it is a global pandemic and numerous countries are suffering and numerous economies are suffering. But rationality must at all times play the biggest part in making these regulations, because many people are losing their livelihood. Many small businesses are suffering tremendously as a result of these rigid regulations. And that is what the court said. The court said, go back to the drawing board, take these 14 days and determine whether these regulations are rational or not. And yes, we know that you are trying to save lives. We know that there is a global pandemic. We know that there are it is one of the greatest pandemics that this world has ever seen. But rationality and constitutionality must still prevail at the end of the day. And unfortunately, the government has now decided to appeal that.
Take us through, Mr. Roux, what would the process have looked like if the government would have gone with what you think they should have gone with? Had they sat down, taken this 14 days to, let's say, rectify the issues that they could have changed? How would that change? Would have changed the process? Would they then have said, okay, we're looking at this situation, we could have changed this and gone back to the courts? How would that have really played out had they decided not to appeal and instead go with the route that you're now speaking about?
Well, they have 14 days, which means that the court identified the two main areas that the court identified was the restriction on movement of members of society, as well as the restriction on free trade. So, in other words, referring directly on businesses and small businesses now being affected severely as a result of the regulations, as well as our constitutional right to move around and move freely uninhibited. And they could have taken those two areas and they could have identified them and they could have looked at the regulations and said, okay, certain areas obviously need some attention, but certain areas are crucial to try and curb the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, gatherings. Look at gatherings. Is it reasonable to say that people can have a dinner party at their house and a maximum of 5 people or 6 people are allowed, but they must adhere to the following conditions? And if people adhere to it, then they are acting lawfully. Hair salons. Can a hair salon operate as per normal? They must adhere to the following conditions. If they adhere to it, it's lawful. But what the government has done is they've made these blanket regulations that is just curbing movement and free trade completely, and that is what is upsetting society in the extreme. And in my opinion, government should have gone and they should have spent these 14 days and used it in order to try and get these regulations in line with the Constitution. And once again, I must say I'm disappointed that the government has come out now to say that they want to appeal this.
Yeah. What happens should the government lose this appeal? What does it mean for, of course, it's bad for the government itself, but for the people of South Africa, and I think that's what's really important at this point. What does it mean for the people of South Africa moving forward in terms of how we're going to be dealing with this pandemic should the government then lose?
Well, I think one thing is clear, and that is that the only way that a society and a government survives a national state of disaster and a lockdown situation as we find ourselves in is when society supports the government. Now, the only way that society supports the government is if society feels that the government is acting in their best interest. So there are two options for the government to follow now. They can approach the Constitutional Court directly with the appeal, or they need to go back to Judge Norman Davis in the Pretoria High Court, and they must apply for leave, launch an application for leave to appeal. If he says to them, no, I don't think that a higher court will come to a different conclusion, then the appeal process would have to take the form of an appeal to the Constitutional Court. So, those are the technical aspects to it and the technical avenues that they can follow. But, one can only imagine that if their appeal attempts fail, that government is society is just going to lose more faith in government, which is a situation that they already find themselves in. So, one would have to wait and see how this pans out.
All right, let's see how this all plays out, and hopefully you'll be sitting with us again to look at it once more. Thank you very much, Ulrich Roux. Always a pleasure having you with us. That's legal expert Ulrich Roux. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.